All right. Greetings and welcome to Voyager Upon the Dawn channel. I'm Christopher, and for the inaugural episode, you wanted the best, you got the best. Please welcome from sunny Scotland, a long-term writer for Sea of Tranquility website and deputy editor for the Fireworks magazine, the Prague professor himself, Mr. Stephen Reed. How you
Oh,
doing,
thank
Stephen?
you very much for that. I think that's overstating things quite a lot, but I'll take it. I'm cheap. I'll take any compliment that's coming my way. You wanted the best. You got a Kiss poster in the background. That'll do. That's it. That's as near as we go.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I knew the Kiss poster was going to be in the background, so it's like it
Yep.
works. But
Yep.
on that note, just a real quick kind of philosophy for the channel. One of the things I'm really kind of wanting to go for here is focusing on the things that we love, we want to talk about, we want to share the positives, and leave the negatives and the hate to other people on the internet. So
Yep. That sounds
uh,
good.
for this episode, I titled it "Brave New Worlds: Albums that have expanded our musical horizons." So these are they're important to our musical development that have really opened other things up. Not necessarily like these are the favorite albums of all time. These are just ones that have been very important to us. And on that, take it away.
Well, it was a very interesting topic that you kind of asked me to talk about. And I looked at different ways of approaching albums that have kind of shaped what I listened to or changed my mind or changed my perspectives on things a little bit. And without really having any much of a plan other than to look through my list of albums. Hello, I'm Stephen and I'm a listaholic.
Yeah.
Okay, I do like a list. Realistically, most of my albums come from roughly the same era. That doesn't mean to say that I listened to them in that era, funnily enough, because I'll start with number one, and this is Y and T. Okay, yesterday and today, or Y and T as they became. And this is Earthshaker. So this was the first album under the Y&T banner. Okay. Um, they had two albums as Yesterday and Today prior to that. So this was released in 81. And in 81, to give away all my secrets in one go, I was 8. Okay, so I didn't really
Okay.
listen to this when I was 8, all right, to be honest with
Yeah.
you. So I would probably have cottoned onto this around the mid 80s. This one isn't, but the first one I heard was my brother's. And it just kind of blew my mind, to be honest with you. I mean, I was into a standard heavy metal diet at that age, I would say. So I'd got into music really through Status Quo, who I know aren't huge in the States, never really kind of broke it over there, but have always been a massive act over here. I think they had top 10 singles in 5 consecutive decades or something along those lines, which is impressive in itself. So Quo, Iron Maiden, AC/DC, that was kind of what I grew up on. So to hear American rock as it was, or metal as it was, rock as it is, or whatever you want to call it, kind of just blew my mind, to be honest with you. Hungry for Rock, sorry, opens the album. That's a phenomenal song. Dirty Girl, the ones for me that Rescue Me and I Believe in You, they were just beautifully constructed, but the guitar playing on those songs is just unbelievable. Dave Meniketti is one of those guitarists that for some reason doesn't seem to quite get mentioned in the same category as others. And the reason I chose that as an album that influenced me and shaped my music listening is because when I was having a think about it, I wrote down a list of bands that I then, in the next maybe 2 or 3 years, maybe 3 or 4 years, went out and then bought albums by because I felt it was in some way connected to this sort of sound. And the list is that long that I won't read you at all, to be quite honest with you. So it took everything in from Dokken to Black and Blue, Cinderella, Danger Danger, which were more AOR, but they were kind of influenced by that as well. House of Lords, Impellitteri, Lillian Axe, Striper, I mean, I can go on and on. White Lion, uh, Hurricane, Kicks, Coney Hatch. Yes, I know they're Canadian. Okay, there's lots of stuff in there that it opened up a whole new kind of musical outlook for me, and I started to look a little bit further afield. Most of those acts never really made it over here in the UK, but they were certainly staples of my music listening for the next 5, 10 years. They still are, to be fair. I mean, I don't really grow out of bands. I just expand. Things grow and go from there. I'm not embarrassed by anything I've ever bought. I don't like it all now, but no, not all of it anyway, but not embarrassed by anything I've ever bought. So that was my number one because it was an important album to me, along with Quiet Riot, which was massive in the States. They did nothing over here. So this isn't
Really?
one of the six that I've chosen to talk about, but I felt it deserved a little mention because those were the two albums together that kind of made me think, I need to hear an awful lot more of this.
The singles from Quiet Riot, at least where I grew up in the Philadelphia area, like on the radio, even I grew up in the 90s, but staples like with AC/DC, Guns N' Roses, all those Quiet Riot songs, just you could probably expect to hear them at least once a day,
Yeah,
So
I mean, they never did it over here. It never really happened for them over here. Maybe the fact that the big singles were Slade covers probably did them a disservice over here. Do you know, Come and Feel the Noise and things like that, because people already knew these songs in a different way. So it maybe didn't help them over here. But yeah, great band, underrated band. They did good stuff before, but an awful lot of good stuff after that too, to be fair, that never got the same notice.
very cool. All right. So for my number one, this is I doubt you've you can see that. Heard that there.
Okay,
so,
yeah, I can see it now.
The name is Zao, and the name of the album is Liberate te ex inferis, which is Latin for save yourself from hell. So that's a so real quick kind of musical background. So growing up, dad on the radio, we call oldies, so like 50s 60s pop kind of stuff, which still love. Church music, still love, but that was, I mean, pretty much it. Like, what your parents have on, that's what you listen to. Until mid 90s in the US, I mean, you had alternative rock, you had punk, you had hardcore, that kind of stuff, right? So that's what I was kind of getting into. And then saw this very kind of strange, weird looking album cover one day and was like, oh, and this is before digital stuff, so you get the sample CD and put it in and stuff like that. And what came out was just for a little background. So these are essentially like kind of like punk hardcore kids who in the mid 90s were like, hey, all this sort of European extreme metal, whether it be kind of like a Carcass, like a death metal, that kind of a thing, we kind of like that. We don't necessarily know how to play it exactly like that because kind of where we're coming from. But this album specifically, it's got the extreme vocals, very dark. The songs are kind of coming from like your 2-minute punk song where it's like you're 3 chords, you're kind of melodic-y solo, and you're out, kind of opening things up a little bit. Just you've got like acoustic intro, you've got sort of like a hand clap bridge, so like just very kind of odd things for what I was coming from, but dark, heavy, but still. So I fortunately I was able to see them. This came out when I was about 16. When I was 18, I got to see them in person, and it's like all these kind of weird things that I'm not sure if you're familiar with the band Neurosis. They're an American metal band.
Yep.
So they were very much influenced by them. Doesn't sound like Neurosis, but they're trying to bring some atmosphere into things that usually don't have atmosphere. But anyway, so seeing them live, it's like, oh, all that stuff considered, the point of that is to drive the kids crazy in the show and like just to kind of actually have a real kind of build up and a kind of explosion where everyone kind of goes crazy. So it's not quite extreme metal. It's definitely not kind of the punk stuff, but that kind of opened things up as far as like, oh, this heavy stuff, bring it on. And so this is the late 90s. And I listened to it just a couple nights ago and I was 16 again. Like every beat, everything is just like, oh, it's still there. So that's my number one.
And that's exactly what a good album should do. It should take you to a time and a place, in my opinion. That's what I love. So my second album is, okay, so we're at Long Live Rock and Roll, Rainbow here, or Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow as they were before that. And the same again, I must admit that I'm probably going to talk about my elder brother, who was 4 years older than me, quite a lot early on here, because this is another one that initially was from his record collection. Now, the reason that I would say this one shaped a lot of what was to come was, yes, it's classic rock. There's a little bit of progressive elements, maybe more on Rising than there is on this album here. This is shorter, more concise songs, but there's still stuff like Gates of Babylon on here, which is doing something a little bit different and pulling, like Middle Eastern influences into there that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Rainbow Eyes, which kind of made me think, oh, actually, slow songs are quite good. Helps that you've got arguably the best singer that ever was singing one of his best vocals.
Mhm.
And same again, I mean, this was out in 1978, I think it was. So I wasn't listening to this when I was 5. I'm not going to lie to you. I wasn't that cool. Still not that cool. But this was another one that when I started really getting into music, I used to love getting an album, finding out who the people were, and then go and basically hoover up everything that they'd ever been on. Now, when you get a band like Rainbow who had 3 or 4 different, incarnations, that involved a lot of buying. So realistically, from there, I investigated bands like Dio and therefore Elf going backwards. It kind of opened the door to Deep Purple to me. I knew about Smoke on the Water and things like that, but hadn't investigated them until that stage. Michael Schenker, so the MSG group, that was another band that was an obvious in through likes of Graham Bonnet. Fandango from Joe Lynn Turner. Then there was Whitesnake from kind of all kind of connects and interjoins, and so many band members were in this one and that one, but not this one, but that one. I mean, you had guys like Neil Murray who were in Whitesnake, was in Black Sabbath, and you got Ronnie James Dio was in Sabbath, but not with Neil Murray, and so on and so on and so on. It's worth mentioning even Joe Lynn Turner's solo album, Rescue You, which is one of these underrated classics from the era. But I mean, you had Wild Horses that Jimmy Bain, the bassist, was in. There was just so many different bands that were doing something similar but different to what I'd heard on that album, that it just immediately branched out and opened up just so many options and different sounds for me that were all based on what we now call classic rock. Back then they were probably a heavy metal band, Rainbow, in their first 3 albums, and then it became something slightly different after that, which I like too, I have to say. I do like the more commercial AOR sound as well. But it was just an album that really, my brother had that one and he had the debut. The debut is a little bit tamer. I don't think it's got quite as many of the intricacies that they grew into. Rising is seen as very much their kind of, the seminal Rainbow album. But that just happened to be the one that I came in at. Long Live Rock and Roll was the one that I came in at, and it just, my record collection went from probably that to about that in the space of a couple of months, because I just went out and said, oh, he's on this and he's on that. And I still have them. I used to buy lots of books that just had a little bit about the band's history and then a discography, and I would go through and just see who was on what, and right, I have to go and buy all those ones now.
Yeah.
So it cost a lot of money, that album.
All the kids who are probably not watching, this is before the internet, and you had things like books, and you couldn't just go into Wikipedia and be like, oh, go down the rabbit hole. You had to actually kind of, read the liner notes and then try to figure these things out. So
yeah, I mean, I used to love getting some sort of heavy metal encyclopedia and just reading little band biographies and looking through the discography and seeing what I had and what I didn't, and writing down the ones I was missing. I still do that. And I used to love just seeing who played on what album, what else were they in, what else did it sound like. And really it led me, probably through most of my early record collection, was buy a band, hear a sound, see who was on it, buy those bands. It didn't always take you to good places, to be fair, but more often than not, you would end up with something that you would think, yeah, actually, this is good too. Where can that take me? So yeah, and I still do that now, I have to say.
Yeah. So little spoiler here. Ronnie James Dio is probably my favorite singer of all time.
Okay.
Definitely metal. Of definitely heavy metal. I've got my Dio t-shirt over there. But as far as just a real quick, like sort of one of my live pinnacles was my wife and I got to see Heaven and Hell one of
Mhm.
the last dates, probably a couple months, before he passed. And for a bunch of guys who are in their 60s pushing 70,
Yeah.
blowing it, anything else quite like that out of the water. I mean, he was just as a stage presence was awesome.
Yeah, wasn't he? Yeah, I mean, I saw them on that tour as well. They played Scotland, I presume, before they went over and did the States. And they played the same night as Tesla, who's another band I've always liked, and right from the debut album. I've never seen them live. And it was one of those, okay, they're both playing on the same night. You could probably walk between the venues in the space of 15 minutes. Who am I going to go and see? And I thought, well, do you know, my first ever gig was Dio, Warlock supported, and they were fantastic. By complete coincidence, and this shows how much I like a list, my 100th gig was Dio. And I kind of thought, do you know what? I need to see him in that situation, playing those songs with the right musicians. And I'm so glad that I did, because it was just utterly outstanding. And obviously, and sadly, it was the last time I got a chance to see him. I've seen Last in Line since then in a very small venue in Glasgow, and that was to see a guy like Vivian Campbell, Jimmy Bain was playing, Vinny Appice in a venue about the size of this room that I'm sitting in now was just quite mind-boggling. It made no sense to be able to basically touch legends, you know?
Yeah. Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and yeah, so lots of good memories that have come from that album, although we're talking about Dio as opposed to Rainbow.
Yeah.
Although unfortunately last time I saw Rainbow, which was last year or the year before, wasn't very good. But there you go. The only time I
But
saw Rainbow, I could have seen
it's
Blackmore, in fact, and it just wasn't very good.
yeah, it's the journey. Sometimes you're gonna run into things that don't work. But
Yeah, absolutely.
excellent. All
So
right,
number
so
two.
number two. So this one's gonna be a little weird, a little out of left field. Probably don't talk about these guys on Sea of Tranquility very much, or this guy, I should say. But can you see here? That's Paul Oakenfold,
Oh,
Transport.
okay.
So late 90s, techno, ambient, trance, all this different stuff. It just exploded. And coming from a very kind of pop or rock kind of background, and then you hear this 8-minute thing that has all these beats on it with all these weird kind of bubbly noises. Like I didn't even know what a synthesizer was, digital, analog, or otherwise at the time. And it's just like, what is this? And this is sort of like when I did the list, it's like, this is kind of a guilty pleasure. Like you can't talk about electronic music or whatever, and like, well, this really opened things up eventually for like your Jean-Michel Jarre and your Tangerine Dreams and maybe more respectable things. And then
That will become more relevant than you realize.
I listened to it, and I was like, well, I wasn't planning on talking about it's the dancey side of things. No, it's just as fun. You can't help but kind of move. It kind of each song kind of takes you on a journey. There's a lot of kind of remixes of Paul Van Dyk stuff, a lot of the kind of early what became trance. A neat blend between kind of very ambient and spacey, but a little bit more immediate as well, and just a lot of fun. And a real quick story. So you've got the 16, 17-year-old into just the angry music, right? And my when I was a senior in high school, my mom and I were like, hey, let's play hooky, go someplace cool. We ended up going to the Philadelphia Art Museum, which is like the Rocky. I don't know if you've ever seen Rocky.
Yep. Yeah.
Runs up the steps. That's the Philadelphia Art Museum.
I'm with you.
Yeah. And I was like, hey, I'm gonna put this in on the trip down. And she's like, oh no, like what kind of crazy thing? and after about like 15 minutes, she's just kind of like, oh, okay, this is nice, like this is just kind of space. Like I don't know what I have no idea what this is, but this is kind of neat. And then on the way back, she's like, hey, can you put that whatever that was, put that back in there, sort of a thing. So again, like, I mean, pretty much anything ambient, electronic, whatever, Underworld, Orbital, The Orb, all that kind of stuff started with Paul Oakenfold. So.
Okay, because the Orb and Orbital are probably all I know from that scene. It has to be said. It's not something I know much about, but it is as nuanced and as deep as this kind of rock and prog scene as well, I believe.
And it's to bring the progressive side, people call this progressive trance because there's not really vocals, or
Right.
relatively. And to be honest, like like you think of like I don't know if it's Sasha and Digweed, that kind of a thing. They're not really dance records. They're more kind of headphoney, long. Like you really kind of have to keep your attention, or kind of be doing something else, but taking them in. So I still love electronic music and all its different forms and stuff like that. And that was the start.
That's it. So it's interesting and very nice of you to call me the professor of prog. I can't say it, but you can. Because I don't actually know if I've chosen a prog album for any of these. It's interesting that. However, what I've got for my third option
Nice.
is
Yes.
Jeff Wayne's War of the World. So it's not prog and it's not progressive, but it is. It's a concept album. It has lots and lots of synth and keyboards on it. It's got spoken word parts. It's got phenomenal artwork. I've got this on CD and expanded versions and various things, but to talk about it, you have to talk about this version realistically, because it's just absolutely beautiful and absolutely stunning. And this opened my eyes. I really got this because, well, Phil Lynott was on it. So, this must sound like Thin Lizzy, obviously. And obviously, therefore, doesn't at all.
Yeah.
So this was an eye-opener for me. This was one of these things that right from, it was just, what is happening here?
Yeah.
What's going on? What have I bought? And this is probably one of my most played albums over the years. It's just a phenomenal piece of work. Richard Burton's narration is just, even now, it just stops me in my tracks, I have to say. His voice is just there's so much authority there, and you can't help but be captivated by it. But musically, this is a really good album too. There's pop, there's rock, there's prog, there's a bit of funk, there's telling the story. It moves with the action, and it moves in a way that most albums probably never could. And this opened my eyes to not prog, because it's not progressive, but I would put this album down as why I love things like Ayreon, where you're getting a story. The concept is as important, possibly, if not more important sometimes, than the music itself. Ayreon's latest album, which has got Tom Baker, the Fourth Doctor, Doctor Who on it, who's doing all the narration on that one. That's a direct descendant from this. And there are so many albums, Voxen itself, so by Saracen, which has got phenomenal narration in it, that they probably wouldn't exist, these albums, without this one. And it was also a massive success, which makes no sense, other than there's things like Forever Autumn on here with Justin Hayward from the Moody Blues singing. So you've got a hit as well, and you've got David Essex, who was massive at the time. It was just, this should never have worked. It has everything about it that should have just said niche album that sold about 10 copies and people spoke about it that they loved and didn't really. But it's none of those things. It's a phenomenal album that touched so many people, and you still hear, even here in the UK, where rock music really isn't much of a presence anywhere in the mainstream, you still hear Forever Autumn on daytime radio, and we're going now, where are we now, 40 plus years in the future. We still haven't been invaded, but the music is still everywhere. So great album. I love this album.
It's interesting because it's like, if you were to release that type of album 10 years earlier, 10 years later, would it really have, with just with the way the public was, would have really worked,
No, arguably not. The last concept album, and lots of people will correct me, and they happily can hear it in the comments underneath. Misplaced Childhood by Marillion was taken high in the charts, and I'm struggling to think of a concept album that, in the way that we mean like a concept album, in that sense, that really has done that since. Now, I'm sure there must be, and there's lots of genres out there that I know absolutely zero about, that I'm sure I've got albums with stories and themes and concepts that have done something, you know, quite similar or quite spectacular that I'm just not aware of. But certainly in this style of music, as you say, it needed to be the late 70s for this to have any traction whatsoever, because this sort of music could get on the radio, it could get some television coverage, do you know? And it still, to some extent, makes no sense. And I think the only kind of follow up or not follow up because it's not connected to this, but the only other sort of album that he's tried since in a similar vein was Spartacus, which I only bought, I think, because Fish sings on it. And it's remarkably disappointing because, well, you're just never going to do two of these, are you? Do you know? So there's no surprise that this still tours. I went to see it, I was going to say recently, probably 5-10 years ago, not as recently as I would like to think. And it still has the same effect live as it does on this. But I must say, every couple of months, I still listen to this. And I still listen to it from start to finish because I can't not get to the end of the story, even though I know what happens, obviously. But yeah, phenomenal album. I love this album.
When you brought that up, it actually the Gandalf's Fist album that you recommended. When I listened to that, and with all the narration, and it's very, very story based, I was kind of like, oh, you know,
Yeah,
I could see how there could be an influence there. So
yeah, I mean, that was the Clockwork Fable, and that's kind of one of those albums that's maybe taken it to its logical conclusion, whereas this is a story with music alongside.
yeah,
To
true.
me, things like the Clockwork Fable are almost a radio play set to music, where you've actually got all of these characters voiced by different actors. They're not even necessarily singers or whatever. And Gandalf's Fist have done that, in my humble opinion, as well, if not better than anybody else has with that album. It's just quite an outstanding piece of work. But yes, I would agree. You can see the connection between War of the Worlds and things like the Clockwork Fable. It's creating worlds and characters.
Punk, you know, that kind of, you know,
Yeah,
steampunky kind of late, you know, 19th century sort of a thing. So
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
all right, so speaking of Prague, let's see here, bring it back there.
Oh yes.
Yep, Dream Theater, Images and Words. So I was 18 at the Naval Academy, which is an interesting story in of itself. And my roommate was from Singapore, of all places, who was very much out of time with sort of what the cultural influences in the music. He was very much, you know, 80s rock, metal, that kind of thing. And we were hanging out one Saturday, and I saw this, and I was like, oh, that's weird looking. I haven't seen anything quite like that. And put it in, and mind completely blown.
Yeah.
The metal side of things was the Prague side of things. Kevin Moore. I mean, he's probably still, if not my favorite keyboardist, one of them. Just again, I didn't understand what I was necessarily hearing. I couldn't say, oh well, yeah, that's the organ sound or that's the synth sound or whatever. But I just loved it. And as sort of testament, I forget which song specifically off the top of my head, but they have several sort of extended, what I would call kind of Kenny G-esque, like saxophone solos or interludes. Yep. And if they could make an 18-year-old, you know, me think, you know, a saxophone solo is awesome in like 2001, 2002, you're doing something right. You know what I mean? And, you know, James LeBray's vocals are awesome. And not to go, you know, too far down the rabbit hole, but one of the things that I think they did here probably better than almost anything they've done since is including kind of the softer, slower, not quite ballady songs, but kind of more intimate. It kind of slows things down. It kind of gives a little space between, you know, when you're going into, you know, Metropolis or one of the epics. And I think that's a little bit a fair amount of the Kevin Moore influence to kind of slow things down, kind of more somber piano based stuff that he was doing, that kind of, you know, gives you time to come up for air, and then we're going into some real kind of prog metal soloing to kind of help to transition you through. But for me it was like, okay, well that's prog, right? So if every prog band is going to sound like Dream Theater, every heavy metal band is going to sound like Dream Theater, obviously it's not the case, but at the time that just kind of blew my mind, and I was never the same.
For a period, every prog metal band did sound like Dream Theater, to be fair. That's how influential that album was, I think. I mean, I remember the debut coming out, so we're going pre-Le Bris, and there was an advert on the back page of Kerrang, and it was just the album cover, the debut album cover, and it had, what was the tagline? I think it was along the lines of, imagine Megadeth meets Queensryche meets Rush. And I had to go out and buy it there and then on the strength of that, because I thought, well, you can't do that. Do you know? You just can't do that.
Yeah.
And I must admit that the debut album didn't really hit me in the same way that Images and Words did. It hit me enough to think, well, I need to know what they're going to do after that. But Images and Words was just a game changer, realistically. I mean, there are not many bands that you can, I think, really quite strongly put your finger on and say, well, they started a genre. And I'm not saying that they didn't pull lots of influences from lots of different places. You can listen to the first 3 or 4 Dream Theater albums and say, well, they've taken a bit of Rush, and there is some, more UK-based prog elements in there. They are taking the big riffs of the Bay Area scene, and they're melding them and changing them. And the keyboards do come from, more of the synth-based sort of stuff. There was all these influences pulled from everywhere, but to put it together realistically, and I think almost to prog's detriment for a long time, everybody had to be Dream Theater, and the amount of people that tried to sound like James LeBrie was just ridiculous. And it was a curse, I think, for them to some extent. But Images and Words, I mean, as you say, the complexity on that album, but then to have things like Pull Me Under on there, which is just a great melodic rock song that just happens to have some phenomenally technical playing, is just ridiculous. And I do remember putting it on in my bedroom and just thinking, what?
Yeah.
It really was just a game changer.
On the Surrounded, the guitar solo, I remember my buddy's name was Say. I said, I know that's a guitar. How do you do that? What is that? Like, what is he doing to make these sounds? Because I know it's a guitar, but I have no idea how he's doing that.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is, so I guess obviously I came to them about almost a decade after they had released it. And one of the nice things, I think, going forward in the early 2000s, prog metal, I think, think of like a Pain of Salvation sort of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't sound anything like Dream Theater. And, without going on a rabbit trail, I think eventually things kind of diversified a little bit, and people, had a little bit more original or different approaches, as opposed to just like, we're going to sound like Dream Theater,
Yeah, I mean, there was a whole lot of stuff that came after, as you say. Pain of Salvation is a great example. I think Symphony X is a great example, where there were bands who had then brought their own influences into what had been laid down. And that was the key. I mean, there was a period where it really was in danger of kind of eating itself, I think, anyway, prog metal, because it was just desperate to sound like the same thing over and over. That's not to disregard the phenomenal technical musicianship that was going on, but you can only do the same thing over and over so many times before you will eventually ruin what made it so good in the first place. So Pain of Salvation, Symphony X, Vanden Plas, there were plenty of bands that then came after that went, no, let's do this take on it. And the genre now, I think, is remarkably healthy, although it's fascinating. I was listening to some stuff this afternoon that's come out this year. Saris, I think, was the name of the band. And I put it on and got halfway through and thought, yeah, they've listened to Dream Theater. Very good at his
Yeah.
me. I mean, I'm
Oh
not,
yeah.
I'm not
Yeah.
missing that album. It's very good, but even now, I can hear things that you think, wow, that's images and words there,
Oh yeah.
and that shows you that. But it shows you the impact that an album like that can have all those years ago. That something new from a reasonably new band still touches on that so strongly, you know. But there you go.
We just have a real quick pause. I need to let my wife know the baby just woke up. So just give me 1 minute. I'll pause and be right back. Okay. So that's Dream Theater. Back to you.
So, well, you've mentioned this chap already, because my fourth one, there we go, is Jean-Michel Jarre. So this is Oxygen. It also has Equinox on the other side, but this is the album that did it for me, I have to say. They're both great. So this is, so you say synths, but I mean, we're almost pre-synth with Jarre. It was, I mean, I had the pleasure of seeing him, and I meant to look this up and I didn't, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. And there was 3 musicians on stage, Jarre being one of them. And they recreated this album, but with the original instruments. So they actually had to come on stage. I mean, his stage entrance was in one of these egg chairs, and it was just brought on stage facing away from the audience, and the lights went down, and of course he turned the chair and he was on it. And the reason for that was because he wanted to have a little chat with the audience first, because they then had to go and tune up all of these synths and plug things in and get it all so that it would link together. But once they got it on, they go, oh, wow, it was incredible. So this was released in 1977, 76, I think, in France, but 77 beyond that. And this was one of those albums that realistically back then, so I was 4 when this came out. So I had no idea who Jean-Michel Jarre was or what Oxygen was. But it wasn't until I listened to this album probably 8, 9, 10 years down the line that I realised that I knew so much of it because it was on the television, it was theme tunes, it was used in adverts, it was, you know, background music for little bits on television programmes. And there was so much of this album that I already knew that it felt like a friend as soon as I put it on. And it changed my perception, because until this stage, if it didn't have a guitar, then it wasn't rock music. And if it wasn't rock music, well, I just wasn't listening to it. Yeah, absolutely. That's how far it was for me at that stage. At that age, when image is important, and I think making a stand is important to some extent. You know, when you're in your kind of, you know, early teens, mid-teens, I think I certainly identified myself through my music and through some of my, what we now call geekier tastes. Back then it was just, you know, niche sort of, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, weird. That's a good word for it. Back then it was weird, because I was listening to stuff and watching stuff that people were like, what is this rubbish? You know, but it's made me who I am, so probably maybe it was. But anyway, neither here nor there. But this really opened my eyes, because it allowed me to understand that it wasn't all about the guitar solo. It wasn't all about sing-along choruses. I mean, obviously, instrumental music. And this was probably one of the first fully instrumental albums that I owned, and that really touched me. And it really touched me. And I've enjoyed most of his stuff prior and since, after getting into Oxygen. Not all. There are a few moments. More recent times, he seems to have been overweighed by, you know, the spectre of this album to some extent. But this was just an outstanding piece of work, still is an outstanding piece of work. And it opened my mind to people like sort of Klaus Schulze, Vangelis, and just a whole side of music that I wasn't really aware of. And it's interesting that you've touched on this as a kind of precursor into that kind of dance and trance side, which is a genre I know nothing about. I am aware of it, and I don't dislike, but I don't know enough about it, or I'm not into it enough to really be able to talk about it at all. But this to me informed prog as well. And it's fascinating how much prog I listen to that does have flourishes or touches or sounds, certainly sounds that he innovated very much, because there was nobody doing anything like this when this came out. And, you know, and I just think that it's interesting that it's touched, and completely, you know, we didn't plan this, that you would talk about it going into the, you know, the trance sort of side, and I'm looking at it from a different perspective. And it shows you how impressive a musician and an album this is, that it can touch so many different things.
Well, it's also just a question of when you come into it, right?
Yeah,
Because that was influencing stuff that I was listening to at the time, and then you kind of work your way backwards and you find out, oh, and it's with him especially, like even some I forget the keyboardist name, but the keyboardist for Porcupine Tree, I get a lot of
Richard Barbieri.
yes, he was in I think Japan,
Yeah, that's right.
stuff like that. I get a lot of that sort of 70s, maybe 80s kind of ambient,
Yeah,
similar kind of things that he brought into a band like Porcupine Tree, which is not an electronic band at all. Well, I guess at one
yeah.
point they were, but yeah,
Well, at one point they were. I mean, they started off with that kind of electronics, more sort of spacey
yeah.
sort of sound.
Mhm.
Very, although I don't know if they were or not, very drug influenced sort of sound.
Mhm.
Officially heading on a trip somewhere. But yeah,
Yeah, they
even
got a
as
bunch of pills on the cover. It's sort of
yeah, I don't know what I mean. They obviously had a headache that day.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah, okay. I'm not going to tell you that they were, but I'm not going to tell you that they weren't. But yeah, even when they moved into the more song-based stuff, I think you can still hear a Jar influence in a fair bit of what Barbieri was doing. Yeah, absolutely.
So speaking of instrumental, no songs, no lyrics. And you can see Mahavishnu Orchestra, Inner
Oh yeah,
Mountain Flame. So not too long after Dream Theater and getting into really weird music, but before getting into any jazz, there was a recommendation. It's like, well, this is kind of like the beginning of prog metal, and I was like, oh, great, I'll go out and you know give it a shot. Little knowing that these are all jazz
yeah,
musicians playing jazz music,
yeah.
just with modern electronic rock instruments, just very intensely, and putting it on was just like I had no idea what I was even listening to. I loved it. It was awesome. Uh, but I couldn't follow where it was going. Like just the language of it, I had no real reference from. I mean, if you listen to Miles Davis, especially Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, that kind of a thing, going backwards, and it's like, oh yeah, well that kind of makes more sense. But if you only know rock, and especially in with vocals, it's just sort of like, what planet are what happened here? Like, what is this? But between John McLaughlin's, I
Yep,
can't really
McLaughlin.
pronounce it, but his guitar work, which was completely different from anything I ever heard. Um, for this one, John Hammer, with the electric piano, which never sounded better. I mean, how he could use that as well with its limitations is pretty incredible. Jerry Good Goodman, yes, perfect violin foil for John's guitar work. Awesome, awesome stuff, and I'm sure that's what influenced King Crimson. Um, but for me, the biggest, hands down, aspect that blew me away was Billy Cobham's drumming. Was like it didn't sound like it could work, because at any second it could just sort of fall apart, and it's complex, but it sounds almost improvised. He's got, like, this is, I think, some of the first double bass, that kind of thing you'll ever hear. I mean, he's still probably one of my favorite drummers, rock, jazz, or otherwise. um but in a similar way with Dream Theater, I think what people don't talk about is how good they were acoustically. Acoustic drums, piano, guitar, like just the contrast between the intensity of some of the, like, the fusion stuff with the acoustic stuff was just a perfect sort of ebb and flow through the record. And the only complaint I had is when it was over, I was like, wait, that's it? There's no more? It's like 40 minutes. Like, what? There's got to be more to it. But it's they had a very limited career. I think maybe 1 or 2 years. But wow, what an influence! Just
Yeah, a massively influential act, has to be said. And with Cobham's drumming, I mean, you harken back to Buddy Rich and things like that, with the double bass work and various things. But I mean, Buddy Rich was a band leader. He was a guy who really, stopped the music, listened to me. And I mean,
Yep.
I played the drums in my younger years, not to that standard I had. But so I had Buddy Rich albums and they were just jaw dropping. However, personally, musically not all that interesting, because it was all about, let's get the drums on the go and let's, rattle it up and just, show what we can do, which I loved listening to, and I listened to those albums quite a lot when I was younger. But musically, they didn't really excite me. It was more about a technical ability and more about me going, well, how on earth do you play that? Because
Yeah.
I've only got 4 limbs, I just can't do that. But with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, there was a musicality there. As you say, there are moments where you think, can this hold together? But the manner in which those instruments talk to each other, it's almost like they're encouraging everything else. Come along, come with us. You can stay, you can keep up. Yeah, mind-bogglingly, technically musical, and that's the thing, is they were musical. Do you know?
Well, in a similar way with War of the Worlds, I mean, these guys were massively successful, especially being jazz, not rock. And it's like, when else in the history of modern music could these guys, sounding like they did, be successful? So
yeah, I mean, you couldn't imagine that. I mean, now that style of music, if it was to try and hit the mainstream, would be pretty much laughed out of town, to be honest, wouldn't it? Do you know? And maybe that's just because we've become so genreized that it has become so niche now. I mean, the mainstream, let's not get too deep down that rabbit hole, but the mainstream doesn't want to accept very much. I often wonder how bands like Muse, for example, manage to become as big as they are, other than the fact that they write, in my opinion, great songs that are memorable and you can sing along to them. Maybe that's the key. Who knows? But there are a lot of bands out there that you just think, I don't know how they can transcend the genre when so many can't. But back then you could. It didn't matter back then. You listened to the charts back then because the charts were so diverse that if you didn't like the song that was number 15, there was a good chance you'd like the song that was number 14. And that's not really the case now. I think that everything's become very much, it's more of a commodity now. Back then there was an awful lot more individuality about it. But then again, we're talking about when I grew up, so I'm about to say that.
and this is Columbia Jazz, which is for jazz, that's like an institution. And the fact they'd be like, oh, these guys that don't really sound, I mean, they kind of sound like jazz, but this is like, pretty far out there. We'll take a chance with these guys, So
absolutely. But
cool.
Labels were willing to do that back then and also allow bands the chance to create something and not necessarily just be defined by the first thing they recorded. And that's not really a thing these days either. Although the niche labels do it, to be fair. There are lots of bands that are allowed to grow these days. Let's not pretend that everything was rubbish now and great, fantastic back then, because it's not true. But there you go. So for my 5th choice, completely from over here to over there somewhere, well, there's 2 versions of this album. The one that I got into was Dead, White and Blue by a band called Flesh and Blood. Okay. Really naff album cover. Very dark, which tells you a lot about them. They had previously been called Dear Mr. President. Okay. And this is very much almost the same album. There's a couple of remixes and the track orders shuffle about. This one I found reasonably tough to find, but as a completist, I had to have it. And the reason that they started as this and became that was because the White House didn't like them being called Dear Mr. President. So they were asked to desist from that. So they did. And this is an AOR album, but it's not an AOR album in the sense that it's Journey or Foreigner, much though I love both of those acts and much else in that genre. This is a very grown-up and mature album. Remarkably so, probably too much so, because I don't think it confuses a lot of people. It seems to be a love or hate album, and it got just the most glowing review in a magazine called Raw, Rock Action Worldwide, back when it came out in 1989, to the extent that I literally went to the record shop the same day. I was sitting in my bedroom, read the review, folded the magazine, put it down, and walked into town and bought this album, and I took it home and was so underwhelmed, it was unbelievable. it couldn't live up to the expectations of the review, which basically said that this is what the genre should be doing. And my expectations on the 20 minutes into town or half an hour into town and a half an hour back again, by the time I got this home, this was going to be the best album that had ever been recorded, you know?
Yeah.
But what really confused me was just how grown up it is. It is a dark album. I mean, it's everything about it screams unhappy, do you know? You've got song titles on here such as Flesh and Blood, Love and Violence, Hey Daddy, Have You Ever Been Arrested? Okay, we're dealing with issues here that we now deal with all the time. But back then, these were not things that you really spoke about. And I did buy this promo copy from the shop in my ad. I picked this out of the racks with promotional copy on the back. Evidently, the rep only had one in his car or van, and this was the one that the shop asked for. And I happened to be probably the one guy that bought it. There's other titles like Fatal Desire, Reality, Fred Astaire, strangely enough. And it is just such a grown-up, deep, dark, borderline depressing AOR album. It's such a contradiction in terms. Yeah, it should make no sense. And it probably, because I was so disappointed, I took this home, listened to it once, and did that with it. And it got filed, and I would say that it was probably 2 or 3 years later where I was just flicking through one day and thinking, I haven't listened to that really ever. And I put it on, and my jaw just hit the floor. It's just so nuanced. It's just so, it talks to you. It's a stark album, but with sing-along songs that do stick in the memory. But I can understand why nobody knows about it, do you know? Because it's just so, yeah, it just didn't really have any penetration at all in that way. And I think that Julian Raymond, who was a singer, I mean, he's done various things since, and there's a cover, and I actually forget which one, on the most recent Fleetwood Mac album. They covered one of these, but it's completely rearranged. And it shocked me, in actual fact, because I thought, people do know this exists, you know?
Yeah.
And just on a music forum, we were chatting away one day about albums that you love and albums that have moved you. And I mentioned this one, and somebody else came on, may even have been Dave Reynolds, that wrote for Kerrang and writes for Fireworks now, alongside myself. I'm very fortunate to even be in the same breath as people like that. And he had a demo copy of album number 2, which was never released. And they were kind enough, or somebody else was kind enough, to actually send me a CD copy of album number 2, which is not as good as this beauty here, but it's still an excellent CD. And strangely enough, it was actually Joey Hunting, who was in the band, came on the forum and actually asked me for a copy of my copy because he didn't have it. So I was happy to copy it for him and send it to him. And he told me to go and check out the Outpatients, which was the only band that I could really find that they went into after that. And they didn't do anything, most of these guys, after this here. And it was just, it changed my perception of a lot of things, because one, it was probably the main album that taught me not to judge something on your first couple of listens. Do you know, it was probably the first album that I bought that I put away and thought, well, that is rubbish. I should never have bought that. That eventually I then took back out and went, oh, okay, I don't have a clue what I'm talking about, because it's one of the best albums that's sitting in my collection, and I've never listened to it for 3 years. Do you know? But it also kind of made me dig a little bit deeper, because most of that kind of melodic rock genre can be quite straightforward. What you see is what you get. But with Flesh and Blood, I found that what you saw was very much what you took into it. And once you'd opened your mind to what are some stark themes and some deep lyrics, which back then I was looking to rock and roll all night and party every day, do you know? I didn't necessarily want to be hearing songs that were probably based more about child abuse and various things like that. And it certainly made me understand that music could have a message in a way that I hadn't anticipated. So it opened me up to a whole different way of thinking about things more than anything else. Not necessarily lead me on to different bands that were doing something along those lines, or to, you know, a genre that I'd never listened to before, but just to make me listen in a different way. And that's probably why it means an awful lot to me, that album. It always has done, and it always will do. And I do to anyone that'll listen. Talk about it quite a lot because it's an album that's kind of hit me deep in here, you know. So yeah, I like that a lot. Flesh and Blood or Dear Mr. President, very similar, both of them.
Depending on which one.
Yeah.
It's interesting the way you describe it. I think I had a similar experience with an album I know that you're a big fan of, Marillion's Brave.
Oh yeah.
Where it's a fantastic record,
Mm-hmm.
but I really have to be in the right kind of headspace.
Yeah.
You got to listen to the whole thing, and it's the subject matter is not really to be kind of taken lightly, because it's going to pull you in, and you have to be ready to kind of go down those dark avenues sometimes. So
yeah, I mean, as I've said on a Tranquility show that I did, for Brave, for me, I have to be very selfish with Brave. It's an album for me. It's not an album for anybody else. I can't listen to that in company. I have to put it on in the right frame of mind and then soak it in. And as you say, it's an album from start to finish, and it's a journey, and it's intense. And although Dead, White and Blue, which is the version of the Flesh and Blood album that I connect with, isn't quite the same in that way. It's much more song based. There's not a journey. It's not a concept album. It has that same mood about it. It's not party music, but the music is based from a party scene. I was loath to say this because it'll maybe put a lot of people off checking it out. But in terms, it kind of feels a bit 90s. I mean, we're 89, we're at the cusp of moving into the grunge era. They've almost preempted that, let's actually take a step back from, living it up every night and talk about things that have shaped us and been important to us, and actually deal with some issues. And that makes it sound a bit dowdy, because that's what the 90s kind of became famous for. And that's it. Lots of good music too. I mean, lots of great music came from that scene. But I didn't want to call it a precursor of grunge, because that gives it a sound that it really doesn't have. But it kind of holds that ethos where it's a very serious album. And I think that in a genre that probably was known for being pink and fluffy, I think it's understandable why it probably didn't actually find an audience, but I love it. It means a lot to me.
All right, so I've only got digital copies of the next two, but for sake of being dramatic, you gotta
like a bit of drama.
You can see. So this is Talk Talk.
Oh yeah.
I don't even as I was sort of doing notes for this, I was like, okay, well, what genre, kind of like, how do you classify this thing? And I think it's something that you touched on a little bit, but the idea of, well, what's progressive music?
Yeah.
And if you look at where these guys started with kind of like, fun synth pop, but sounds like a lot of other synth pop bands, to Color of Spring, and then to this, if that's not progressive, then kind of what is, even though it doesn't sound like Genesis, it doesn't sound like Yes, doesn't sound like anything really. But interestingly enough, the kind of roots rock, jazz, but I got the last time I listened to this, I got almost like a gospel kind of feel to it.
Mm-hmm.
But also I found out that this is also pretty much all improvisation, that they kind of took months and months of this, kind of brought together, and it's way better than it has any business being, because it sounds like it's an actual composition from start to finish. Each time it sort of starts to lose you and get a little too airy and kind of weird, it brings it back with the intensity of the vocals and especially the organ sound. I'm not sure if it's B3 or what it is, but with it's not a distorted guitar, but it's almost kind of like intense country guitar kind of sound that works so well together and gives it this very kind of organic, earthy, hard to describe kind of a thing. And there's songs on it, but it just feels like one long, journey. And after hearing that, it's sort of like, okay, well, almost anything's possible as far as like what the artist wants to do. And also from my perspective, it's like, if I can't even define what it is that I'm hearing, then, maybe you should give whatever it is a chance, um definitely not metal, definitely not prog, definitely not anything that was really kind of on my radar before I heard it. But especially for, and I think it's a similar thing kind of you talk about with Brave, where it's like, it's not a concept album, but it feels like you really need to listen to it from start to finish. And as far as direct influence, can't really think of very many bands that sound directly like them outside of maybe Sigur Rós or something like that. But it was more of almost like a, I don't know if philosophical is the right word, but like, if you can listen to something as weird and nebulous as this, you can pretty much listen and enjoy to almost anything you hear. So this Laughing Stock, love them both.
I think as well that the era in which those albums came out, there's a distinct sound from that era. And in many ways, as you say, it's definitely not metal. It's progressive, but it's not prog. It's pop, but it's not pop. Do you know? But I think that the technology that was being used at that stage, and certainly the production values that were used at that stage, certainly speaks of a time. It speaks of an era, and it brings a kind of, I use this word quite a lot to describe certain music, and I mean it's a compliment, but it's quite sterile. It's quite clinical, almost, in a way that I think almost makes it difficult for any album that was touched in that way to fit into a genre in a way that maybe a lot of the stuff I've chosen from the 70s, because those production styles and values, classic rock had a feel and a sound. And then kind of the era that you're talking about with that album, there is a sound, but it's more a sound of the technology and the advancements in the studio than it is five guys coming and plugging in and playing some riffs. Do you know? And the value, I think, is very similar between the two, because the end result is something that arguably you'd never heard before, and arguably something that you'd never heard before, but they couldn't be further apart. Do you know? And that, to me, is the beauty of. It's been a very interesting discussion, because I don't know how many genres or styles we've touched on. Do you know? Obviously neither of us knew what the other was choosing here, and it's been a remarkably interesting journey. Certainly listening to music that I hadn't anticipated talking about, but how it all hangs together at the same time, just from the people who were doing it being daring, being innovators. And I think that the thing that touches me about all of the albums that we've spoken about is the people who made them did what they wanted to do. Do you know? There's no genre chasing here. There's no fitting into an era here. It doesn't matter. I mean, yes, my Rainbow album sounds like it comes from the late 70s, because that's just how things sounded back then. The Talk Talk album sounds like it comes from the era that it comes from. But that doesn't mean to say there's anything from that era that you think, well, that sounds like them. There's lots that's come afterwards. As you say, Sigur Rós, maybe so much with Talk Talk, there's not so many bands that have ate that sound. But with Rainbow, there's probably tens of thousands of bands, but you can still listen to them and think, well, only Rainbow sound like Rainbow. You know?
Absolutely.
You get there first. So that's what makes the difference. And although not necessarily with this album, for the last one that I've chosen for this was a guy who kind of made a sound, you know? So this is an album that, I mean, this was 1989 again, so the same era as Flesh and Blood that I picked up there. And they probably couldn't sound any less alike. Do you know? This is arguably Petty at his most commercial. This was the first thing that I listened to by him. I was aware of Tom Petty, but in the same way at that stage, I was aware of Bruce Springsteen and various things like that, where, you know, these guys were standing up, singing songs, playing guitars, so I could accept it. But I wasn't interested because they didn't rock. I mean, they do rock, and that's the thing, that's why this album was important for me, was because it made me understand that these guys do rock and did rock, unfortunately, in Tom's case. And it was I Won't Back Down was the lead single off this album, and it just, I mean, I heard it on the TV or on the radio, and I went and bought the 7-inch single, played it to death. Bought this when it came out, played it to death, and I continue to play it to death because it's just such a strong album. I mean, side one on this album, Free Falling, I Won't Back Down, Love is a Long Road, A Face in the Crowd, which is just a ridiculously melancholy, honest song. I mean, I don't think that anyone could listen to A Face in the Crowd and not think, "Oh, that was me at one point." Do you know when you just see a face of someone that you think, wow, they're amazing? And that's all you got of them your entire life. Do you know? It's just such a simple concept, but done in such a wonderful way. And then Running Down a Dream. Side two is awesome as well, but side one of this album, I mean, I would imagine that the grooves on side one of this album are much deeper than side two for me because it's just the way that I played it. But this allowed me into the world of Springsteen and Jackson Browne, Mellencamp, Ryan Adams going further down the line, Neil Young, who back then I used to have a go at one of my friends who was into Neil Young and say, stupid country rubbish, do you know? And now, I mean, I've been to see Neil Young umpteen times, love him to bits, think it's absolutely fantastic, another innovator. And I've obviously gone backwards with Tom Petty's catalogue, and then I followed everything after that. I became really quite an addict, that has to be said. But this album really opened my eyes to the fact that it didn't have to be, I mean, even though I'm talking about Jar and various things, there was a proggy element there. And I could kind of, in my head, say, well, he's really prog, so that's fine. I can listen to that.
You justify it.
Really justify Tom Petty's being anything other than quite mainstream Americana rock, especially at this stage, do you know? But it's just so effective and it's just so damn good that it made me suddenly think, I mean, I was 16 when this album came out. It really doesn't matter what it is, what it's called. If I like it, I like it. And from here on in, I'm going to buy it. And I'm not going to worry, does anyone think that I'm cool, or, you know, do I think I'm cool? I never have done, but that's not the point. You know, and it just, I mean, the picture on the back just sums the album up. It's just a wonderful album that really has stood the test of time. I think it was his first non-Heartbreakers album as well, which was quite a bold move at the stage. And it was just a real eye-opener for me, as all the albums I've spoken about have been a real eye-opener for me. But this was the one that probably made me grow up a little bit, along with Flesh and Blood. I mean, you can tell I'm 16 at this stage with both of those albums at that time. One, it took me a few years before I went back to it and thought, you know, get a grip of yourself, as you would say here, and you know, stop worrying about stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas with this one, I really just immediately, right from off, I thought, this is just too good to pretend that I don't like it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I don't know if everyone goes through phases like that, but back then, I mean, even Europe's The Final Countdown. I remember listening to that on the television one Saturday morning. I was lying in my bed, the television was on, and The Final Countdown came on, and I thought, is that metal enough for me to like? And the answer eventually was yes, because I went and bought the 7-inch single and I bought the album and really liked it. But that was an inner turmoil with me at that stage. Do you know, that kind of teenage bit where, as I say, I mean, I never had long hair because it all went curly at the back and I wasn't brave enough to grow out. But I had the denim jacket, I had all the patches on the back, and if it wasn't heavy, it wasn't me. And albums like Full Moon Fever and Freedom No Compromise by Little Steven, which is probably not one of his classic albums. That was his third solo or post E Street Band albums, which is probably a little bit more commercial than the early two, which are seen now as classics, and now I understand why. I loved Freedom No Compromise. Very political, obviously, Little Steven. Those were the two albums, Full Moon Fever being the other, that really made me think, do you know what? If it's good, I'm going to buy it and I'm going to listen to it and I'm going to tell people that I like it. And I mean, when I bought Freedom No Compromise, I mean, guys were in the guitar shop when I went round there after. That was my Saturday, go buy some records, go around the guitar shop and speak to guys, play the drums, muck about. And he said, oh, what's in the bag this week? Pulled out Freedom No Compromise. And, oh, you need something about apartheid and all these things. And I went, yeah. I have no idea. You know, so it maybe broadened my horizons in different ways too, in that way as well. But yeah, very much a coming of age sort of period for me musically there. And most of these albums have been, in actual fact. It's been great fun going through it all.
Have you seen it's like 3 hours long. I don't know if it's Netflix, but it's a big documentary on Tom Petty.
Yeah, I have seen it.
And the it might be called "Don't Back Down," but that song, like when you sort of get to see behind the scenes, it's like, wow, this guy was really a rebel. Like he really fought against the man,
Yeah,
and I think he
absolutely.
won, in the end.
Yeah, I would
So
agree with that. I think he won. That's a very good way of putting it. Absolutely. He leaves a remarkable legacy behind him, both in what he did outside of music, but certainly the music that he left behind has just been genre defining in that sense. He didn't necessarily, in the way we spoke about Dream Theater, who I think actually created a genre. I think Tom Petty, along with other major players, became very genre defining. And same again, it was music that didn't really matter what it was. The masses got it because it was just too damn good, you know?
but if I think most people, especially in the US, if they're honest with themselves, they like Tom Petty.
Yeah,
They may
I
not
would,
admit it, but they like it.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And anyone that says underneath it they don't, you do really.
you do. You do. We know you do.
You know, absolutely.
All right. So I teased it out a little bit. Number 6, the name of the episode, Brave New World. Iron
Right,
Maiden,
okay.
Brave New World.
Okay.
So it in the same guy who introduced me to Dream Theater, he had it just come out, Brave New World. The Wicker Man hits, you hear the riffs, and never the same. Never the same. And Ghost of Navigator, Brave New World, The Nomad, like just write down the list. Never heard anything like it. Every aspect of it blew me away. And I was like, and didn't have very much money, but I was like, where do I start? Where's the other stuff that I'm going to get? So went right out,
Yes.
bought Number of the Beast.
See, you're showing my age here because you're showing Brave New World as a starting point. That's my starting point. Is Number of the Beast. That's I mentioned Maiden right at the very start, as you said.
Yeah.
Yep, unintentionally we've gone full circle. But Number of the Beast was me kind of going, okay, I like this music thing.
Oh yeah. Bought Peace of Mind. Don't want to happen to that. Power Slave,
Yes.
and then that next summer, Rock in Rio
Rock in
came
Rio.
out, and we would funny story. So I'm not sure how much you know about the Naval Academy. Probably not. Especially the U.S. one, but freshman year, no music, no movies. You work. You do your homework. You go to class. You do all the Navy stuff. No music, none. Officially. And this is when I'm getting into Iron Maiden, right? So it might be the most metal thing I've ever done. So we would literally hide our Iron Maiden albums like in the room so that when the senior military guys would come through, they wouldn't find it. But when they're gone, or you think you can get away with it, the headphones go on, and Aces High, or Run to the Hills or something like that, and perfect kind of soundtrack for kind of being in that sort of atmosphere. Not that I'm complaining. It was a good thing to do at the time, and I appreciate all that I've learned. I learned in the Navy, postscript, but it was just very interesting to be in that kind of environment in the same time that you're sort of having like, all this, the Navy and metal, not necessarily go to well together. So, but I mean, we would once we were allowed to, we would just watch on loop Rock in Rio and just be like, they've got 3 guitarists, 3,
Yeah.
and they're all really good. Mm-hmm. So and that was just metal. At that point, it was just like, bring it all on. I'll listen to whatever. So yeah.
And
6.
controversially, okay, yes, I like them. Yeah, we should have 3 of them then. Controversially, I'll put my neck on the line here and get lots of complaints. Their last great album.
Which one?
Brave New World.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm just going to put that out there. I can't
Yeah.
help myself. I would probably be safer if I didn't.
Yeah.
I've got a lot of haters. Credibility, not that I had any. That's it. Let's flush it. For me, it's just been that way since then.
Oh.
Me and Maiden don't talk anymore.
Oh. Oh my.
People growing up, I mean, the first 5 albums growing up were just so important to me. Maiden were one of the first 3 bands that I saw, and I saw them on the Seventh Son tour. They were just amazing. Saw them at Donington. They were just amazing. Adrian Smith came back as a guest for that show. Just mind-blowing stuff. And I must admit that the last, whatever that may be, 3-4 albums have just left me so cold that I don't have the words. I don't have the words. It's just, every band should evolve. Every band should do whatever they want to do and sound however they want to sound. But I just don't get it. I just don't get it. And we class them in with prog metal, but thankfully, most prog metal is much more exciting than that. As I say,
So I'll say this. So, if we ever do talk Iron Maiden in more depth, I think there'll be some agreement. There may be some disagreement on certain things.
Yep.
But I get what you're saying. Okay. I don't agree with every instance, but I do see kind of what you're alluding to.
I think as well, to be perfectly honest, there's an age thing at play there, because I think for people, guys my age, Maiden means a certain thing. I think that an awful lot of guys my age, and a little older too, probably, Maiden set a musical course for them, and they were very much an archetypal heavy metal band back in the early days. And realistically, without them, you wouldn't have a Bay Area scene, you wouldn't have Metallica, you wouldn't have Anthrax, you wouldn't have Megadeth, but you wouldn't have Helloween, you wouldn't have that German sort of power metal scene that's grown across Europe and various things like that. And I understand Maiden wanting to detach themselves from that. However, I think they went from being innovators to followers. And that was always a danger for me personally, was once they started moving in a different style that other people, in my opinion, had done better than that, it was always going to be a slippery slope for guys who didn't necessarily want to follow them on that journey. So this is a discussion for another day, and I think that's a good idea for another day too.
if you want to bring up split opinions and have a whole bunch of different people with different perspectives, bring up Iron Maiden, because there's still a lot of people who haven't gotten over them, Paul Di'Anno not being the lead singer. And that's what, it's before I was born.
Oh, yeah,
people are still upset about it, you know? So
yeah, I mean, we're talking about back when I was about 5 or something, for 5 or 6 when Di'Anno left the band. So realistically, yes, we're going back a lifetime even for me with that too. I do get it. I haven't agreed with that, but then again, Dickinson was my guy. But then again, and I'm going to blow all my credibility here, I like the Blaze Bayley album.
we actually talked a little about that. We talked a little about Blaze Bayley in the past, and that is probably a good place to wrap things up.
Yeah, I think so. We're going too far afield here. Yes, let's save this for another day. I agree.
Absolutely. Well, listen. Thank you so much. It's absolute pleasure. As far as being very nervous going into this, you've been great. The discussion's been awesome. I've really enjoyed doing this. In the future, I've got Star Wars episode hopefully with another buddy of mine. You might get a horror movie one coming up as well, and then I'm not sure what your schedule is, but hopefully at some point we can have another discussion, because this is absolutely. I found this a lot of fun.
I thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you very much for inviting me on.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, we'll go ahead and end it here. So take care. Thanks for listening, and signing off.